Thanks for joining us on Capitol View. I'm Fred Martino. The immigration crisis in Illinois sees a number of new developments, and despite controversy, a private prison healthcare company gets a new state contract. We'll look at those stories and much more with our guests, John O'Connor of the Associated Press and Kent Redfield, emeritus political science professor at the University of Illinois Springfield. John, up front this week, it appears former President Donald Trump is staying on the Illinois ballot after a Tuesday decision. Tell us more.
A challenge to the legitimacy of the Trump candidacy, which we've seen in other states. And this went before the Illinois State Board of Elections on Tuesday. They kind of ducked the issue, but they had a couple of pretty good reasons behind it. Number one, this is an issue because of Colorado's decision to remove the former president from that ballot. It will go to the U.S. Supreme Court, and I believe the High Court is scheduled to hear arguments on that next week. So that kind of put, there are multiple states that are considering doing this. Maine was one where the Secretary of State has the decision-making power there and decided to hold off until the Supreme Court decided. The other thing that was one reason that the Illinois State Board of Elections held off. But the other thing was this is a board that's made up of 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, and they decided that that board, their authority does not include deciding whether someone violated the Constitution. What we're talking about here is the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which was adopted after the Civil War to keep Confederates from holding federal office again. After Reconstruction, it was rarely, if ever, used again. So what the claim is that the January 6th, 2021 uprising, insurrection is what it's called at the Capitol, was fanned by Donald Trump, who was still president then, and did not discourage and perhaps encouraged those his supporters from storming the Capitol and trying to get the election results overturned.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And as you point out, critical to get some sort of ruling from the Supreme Court that will give guidance, because it's fascinating when you look at a map, the very large number of states where proposals have formally come forward or are being considered. This is, it's something where there has to be guidance from the highest court in the land, and I'm sure not everyone is going to agree with whatever is decided there, but without it, it just becomes a nightmare. Not only a nightmare in terms of voters not knowing who will actually be on the ballot, but actually printing ballots. There are deadlines, and so this is just a huge challenge for elections officials all over the country. I would assume John, you would think that there will be some sort of definitive guidance here coming.
The other thing you didn't mention there is the precedent that would be made by this decision. The Supreme Court, of course, has 3 Donald Trump appointees on it. That's not to say that they automatically rule in the president's favor, but you have to think that as human beings, it gives even learned justices a great deal of pause to say in the United States of America, we are going to ban someone from exercising their right to seek public office. I don't know how they'll rule, but that's got to be, like I say, give them pause, and not to mention, and this shouldn't go into their decision making either, but not to mention the fact that if he were banned from any state ballots, it will cause quite a ruckus among his supporters once again.
Absolutely. Well, we'll be watching. Kent, we move on to you now. You are going to bring us up to date on the immigration crisis. First, let's tackle this. Tensions are growing between Chicago state and federal government officials. Among others, Capital News Illinois reported on this. Tell us more.
Well, this started out as something that, Chicago was targeted by Texas as a place to send immigrants. Some of them are asylum seekers. Some of them may be, in the country, illegally. You have to sort all of this out of exactly who you're talking about. A large portion of these people are from Venezuela, and so you've got a targeted effort to send these people to Chicago, New York, tend to be Democratic cities, large cities. You're trying, Texas is trying to put pressure on the federal government to change policies and the president to change policies. So it's in Chicago's lap. That's where the people are coming. I don't think, this is not something you would, there was no existing infrastructure process. So, like the pandemic or anything else, when you're hit with a problem, then you're scrambling to try and figure out exactly how to deal with this. Chicago certainly, in terms of listening to the mayor, would like to have more help from the state. He'd like to make it the state's problem. The governor has avoided taking this over because Chicago has not only tremendous resources, but it is also a strong home rule unit that doesn't need, permission for the state to deal with the problem. As it has grown, misstep after misstep in terms of exactly how we're going to coordinate between the state and the city. And, the city has changed plans a number of times. And so, both the governor and the mayor, certainly would like the federal government to get more engaged. But
and on that note, Kent, the federal government, on that note, as you're aware, what you said in the beginning of your response there, that Texas was trying to get the federal government to act. Now we know that in Congress there have been bipartisan efforts and basic agreement on portions of a bill, but it may be dead. Even if it passed the Senate, it may be dead in the House because former President Donald Trump has spoken out against this agreement. Interestingly, I've heard no one say that the agreement represents no progress. In other words, that there are elements that actually have been proposed by some of those who may be saying now that they don't want this bill. So there's two things there. One is, what do you think the result of that will be if this bipartisan attempt fails? And the second thing is the larger statement about what this is about governing, because governing is always compromise, right? I mean, you can't get everything in a bill, and so is some progress viewed as progress?
Yeah, and I think that it's in serious doubt that we're going to get a resolution, except that at some point we're probably going to shut down the federal government, and you hope cooler heads will prevail. I don't think, but Illinois cannot assume help is on the way. So And the governor, while he doesn't, he would like to not own this, he really does own it. And we're going to have a national Democratic convention in the late summer in Chicago. And, he does not want this to be the lead story when the attention of the national attention, world attention, shows up on is focusing on Illinois. So it's a difficult problem, and then it bumps up against the state budget, and so Senator Harman.
Well, let's get to that. Let's get to that. Let's get to that issue, because while the crisis is centered in Chicago in terms of the tens of thousands of people who have arrived, many of them on buses paid for by Texas over the last year, they're in Chicago. Illinois citizens are paying the bill here. We're talking about $500 million that has been mentioned by the state. More than that when you add in diversions from other budgets, including $160 million recently from Human Services. And as you say, this is expected to be a major issue in the General Assembly, and it's clear now that both parties are concerned about how to approach this. On the Democratic side, Senate President Don Harman is now coming out against a standalone bill to care for immigrants. Tell us more about what he said and your analysis of where that goes.
Well, he said, there have been initiatives, talk about, well, we need to have an emergency appropriation and be able to focus on this problem. And, we're coming up on a budget session, and all of the signals are that next year's budget, you're looking at significant deficits because, we've been spending COVID money and other money, that was one-time money. So we've got, this is going to be a really tough budget absent having to deal with this problem. And so, what the Senate president is saying is, everything has to be on the table, and we have to, we can't end up, slashing other major programs. And we've got initiatives like a child tax credit with a huge price tag that some in the legislature want to put on top of that. So
yeah, and I know the Senate president, he also addressed the notion that, we've talked about addressing many of these problems for a very long time for citizens here, and now it's the optics are very difficult when the actions are being taken now, but hadn't been taken in the past for people here.
Yeah, we are really good at putting off problems and papering over budget issues in Illinois, and we're coming up to a situation where this is going to be a really tough budget, and the only thing that good that you can say from the Democrats' perspective, because they own everything. The Republicans, they can hold press conferences. They're pretty irrelevant to the actual, what the numbers are going to look like. And so it's fortunate that, we don't have any statewide elections going on, and that the Democrats have an overwhelming majority in the legislature. If this were a competitive situation, or the governor was up for re-election, this would be a perfect opportunity to frame it in terms of failure and time for a change and all of that. And so the Democrats have some time to work this out, but it is this is going to be a very bad year where they're going to have to tell a lot of people no in order to get something close to a balanced budget.
No is not a word that you like to hear when you're advocating for money with the General Assembly. All right, we need to move on now. John, we move to your reporting on a private prison healthcare company. It is accused, according to your report, of substandard care, but has been awarded a new contract in Illinois. Tell us about that.
Wexford Health Sources, Fred, is a operation out of suburban Pittsburgh, and it's actually provided health care for inmates in Illinois prisons since 1992. So they're not new to the game. Their most recent contract was for a little more than $1 billion with a B from 2011 to 2021. Now, over the years, they one argument that was made for contracting with this firm, and as you hear with a lot of privatization in government, is that they'd be able to recruit the medical professionals they need more easily than if they were state employees. But the problem that Wexford has had repeatedly is vacancies. Their physicians have a vacancy of about a third of the positions they need or that they contract for among physicians are vacant, and 50% of nurses. So it's difficult. This has resulted in a lot of in several federal lawsuits, and they've the corrections department has paid out millions and millions of dollars in settlements over the substandard care. There are two federal consent decrees ordering them to provide better care for mental health services and for medical services. But in more than once, a federal judge or a monitor for these consent decrees has declared that Wexford is not providing, or the corrections through its contractor is not providing the constitutional standard of care that is guaranteed by the Constitution. So
what do you make? I mean, what was the justification, knowing that, of signing another contract with the company?
Well, it's I think what it comes down to, they had two bidders. One was substantially lower, about $600 million lower than Wexford, but there are a number of companies in the country that do this sort of service. But I think that Wexford, provided. It's hard to get an answer from the administration. I've had difficulty getting anyone to talk to me about it. I think that Wexford had crossed all the T's and dotted all the I's. What's interesting is that the last contract expired in 2021, and so they've been renewed several times over that 2-year period. In the meantime, the legislature has said we need to go a different direction here, and it'll be interesting to see how lawmakers respond to this, because one would think that they would have examined those possibilities over that 2-year period.
Okay. Well, something certainly that maybe calls for more in terms of information about how this is continuing, and often that comes from either oversight at the state level, where folks, it's their job to do oversight and do reporting on how things are going, or it comes from reporting and investigations, because as you point out, sometimes you can't simply get an answer through an interview. You're not getting clear answers all the time through that approach, and additional investigation may bring us some answers down the line. That is a perfect transition, Kent, to our next story. I mean, we rely on journalism every week to make this program possible. And sometimes, like with this story, it's the beginning and not the end of the digging and the answers for something. Here in Illinois, though, and across the nation, as we all know, there is a crisis in journalism. Layoffs continue, particularly at newspapers, some of which are shutting down completely. We've lost many journalists and many newspapers, and journalists in other areas as well. Well, now a panel of experts put together by the Pritzker administration has issued a report, and they are suggesting legislative measures to reverse the decline in journalism in Illinois. Tell us more about that, Kent.
Yeah, the problem is is there. I don't think there's any dispute at all that we've had this dramatic decrease, particularly in terms of local coverage, but major newspapers have also had serious cutbacks in their ability to cover the news, and this is an economic problem in terms of business model, and so it is not it is hard to make newspapers profitable given the changes in the way that people communicate and the rise of social media. And so we're looking for ways to provide some assistance on economic viability.
Yeah, and I know the panel suggested things like tax credits. What else did they suggest? Because we do need to move on to one more segment from John.
Yeah, and so, tax credits, also things like advertising set-asides. And so, when government spends money on advertising, focusing it on the local outlets. So, they're going to work the economic side. There's discussion on, well, we need to have better training, more opportunities, but that runs up against the problem of not having placements once you train good journalists. We do have a lot of that in Illinois. The problem is trying to make either these local, more legacy kinds of operations viable, or, there's a movement and the state may be able to play a role in developing more local, the Chicago block, I won't mess up the name, but there's an organization, that's more of a citizen journalist operation in Chicago that, is perhaps another model. The state might be able to, how can we grow things from the grassroots? This is, everybody, they're pretty much trying everything because it's such a pervasive problem, and the basic economics are, work against, doing what we want, which is to have good local news.
Absolutely. So again, something we'll continue to watch, and without journalists and journalism, we miss things very often that would never see the light of day without reporting. I want to wrap up with a little hope, a little good news. It's nice to be able to do that. John, Illinois is partnering with Google to launch a new portal for children's mental health resources, a very critical issue for Illinois and for the entire country. What did you learn about this?
Transformation initiative that they started, announced a year ago. The focus of that was to centralize mental health services or the avenues for reaching that. There's a crisis in mental health particularly among young people. A disturbingly high percentage of young people today say that they have depressive episodes and even suicidal ideation. The problem was that the resources were spread across a variety of departments. And basically what this does is Google has stepped in and is partnering with the state to provide a portal where parents and caregivers can go to one-stop shop essentially to find to find out what services are available and to access those, and even to be able to download whatever documents are necessary for that. So it was it does, you say, end on a positive note. It does seem like a real good intersection between private industry and a high-tech private industry and state government and the services that it needs to provide.
Absolutely. Very interesting and a nice, with all the challenges, nice to end with some progress on a very important issue. I want to thank my guest, John O'Connor of the Associated Press, and Kent Redfield. He is Emeritus Political Science Professor at the University of Illinois Springfield. Gentlemen, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Fred.
All right, and thank you for being with us at home as well. For everyone at WSIU, I'm Fred Martino. Have a great week.